Before the Second World War, humans had been slowly whittling down the populations of animals living in the U.S., fueled by illegal hunting and under-the-table fur trades. Even the populous alligators in the Everglades were nearly wiped out, and sightings of the mighty buffalo were becoming so rare that you might as well have been out looking for a unicorn. But the end of the Second World War brought an end to most of the senseless killing, both of humans and of animals. New laws and better policing of the national parks gave the animals who called the wilderness home a chance to recover. Now there are more alligators, buffaloes, deer, elk, wolves, and mountain lions than ever. Only the wolves and buffaloes are still playing catch-up, but the rest of the endangered species are no longer at risk at all. It truly is remarkable what we've accomplished in these past years. Rocky Mountain National Park is one of these protected places. It's teeming with wildlife, and people come from all over the country to see them. But with rising populations also comes greater risk, especially when people continue to move deeper and deeper into the wildest areas where predators roam free. In July 1997, a female mountain lion was out on the prowl. By now, she was an experienced hunter and often took down heavy game like deer. But her progressing pregnancy was starting to make movement difficult for her. The big game was no longer an option. Even the old bucks and small calves that were usually easy pickings were always surrounded by younger and stronger deer with heavy hooves. With her limited mobility, those hooves could be the death of her, or at the very least, the death of her cubs before they were even born. She needed a few decent kills to sustain her for the first few weeks after she gave birth. She wouldn't be able to leave the den that she'd already prepared for her upcoming litter during that time. Whatever she could kill in the next few days had to be enough to give her sufficient strength to give birth to her cubs and also to be able to produce milk for them. She'd spent the last week attentively observing her surroundings, formulating a new plan of action. It needed something bigger than the small game that had been supplementing her, but not too big to pose too much danger. The mountain goats were still too big, and they came with murderous horns. But the rodents and hares weren't big enough to offer much sustenance. And then there were the humans that frequented the mountain lion's home. They were loud, and sometimes they carried metal sticks that made more noise than the cat had ever even heard before. Those strange sticks could bring down a deer with a single blast. The humans seemed like a good upgrade from rodents, but they were rarely out on their own, always surrounded by other human companions. Still, the smaller ones were a very good option to go for, but only if she could catch one as it wandered away from its pack. When it fell asleep the night before, the cat was mulling the details over in her mind, and by the time it woke the next morning, she had formulated a plan. And right as it predicted, like every morning, the small groups of humans came into the wilderness at the crack of dawn. Small families, large groups of friends, and pairs of lovers drifted into the wilderness at the early hours of the morning. Most of them walked the trails to Cascade Falls. The waterfall was the main attraction of that part of the park, and it was so well traveled that animals big and small avoided drinking water there at all. Instead, they preferred to go downstream a few miles to avoid the people altogether. The cat watched several groups go by, waiting until a band of humans came in that had smaller ones with them. It honed in on a group of 5 and followed them into the trees. She stayed far behind them, watching to see if it could get lucky enough for one to finally break free from the rest. The group had 3 adults and 2 children in it. The mountain lion was keeping an eye on the 2 smaller ones. The Miedema family was completely unaware of the fact that they were being followed the moment that they stepped foot in the forest. Kathy and David brought their 2 children, 6-year-old Rose and 10-year-old Mark, for a day out in the woods. With them was a friend and colleague of Kathy's. Kathy was a registered nurse, and her friend Dina was the receptionist at the hospital where they worked. Chatting and strolling leisurely along, the group stopped frequently for snacks and bathroom breaks. Mark had a bag of peanuts to nibble on as he walked, but he didn't eat any of it. Instead, he dropped them on the ground, one by one, making a little trail for them to follow when they turned back. His imagination ran wild as he laid down the trail of peanuts. His thoughts were full of Hansel and Gretel and their breadcrumbs, pirates following the dotted lines on their treasure map. He was creating his own little adventure with only peanuts and the power of his child mind. This imaginary world was a lot more fun than listening to his mother and Dina complain about work anyway. About 3/4 of the way to the falls, Mark's peanuts ran out, but he looked back at the line of nuts behind them with satisfaction. If the birds and squirrels didn't notice it, then they'd find his perfect dotted line on their way back, like a real treasure map, with the car in the parking lot being their treasure. Meanwhile, from the shadows, the cat was still watching. Every time Rosie or Mark stepped into the bushes to relieve themselves, the feline in the shadows inched forward. But every time, just as she thought that the children were in her grasp, Kathy or David stepped forward to keep them in their sights. For the first half of the trail, all the way to the falls, the female targeted only Rosie. She was the smallest of them all, and surely the tiny child would be the easiest one to bring down. But the little one spent her time on her father's back or holding her mother's hand, practically attached to her parents' hips. The predator was properly tired by the time the 5 of them reached the falls. It had been hours of stalking, just to be interrupted by one of the adults every time. But she'd at least remain hidden in the brush, staying just far enough to remain out of sight. The Miedemas and Dina still had no inkling that they were being actively hunted in broad daylight. At the falls, the animal moved in closer, her movements masked by the running and crashing of the waterfall. She was so low to the ground that her swollen belly skimmed the forest floor. She knew that the day had already dragged on so long that if she gave up her stock, she probably wouldn't eat at all. So she stayed on, for now, just watching them. She was so desperate that she was even willing to try for one of the adults, as long as at least one of them wandered away on their own. That's when the other smaller one caught her eye, drawing her attention away from Rosie. The boy was bigger, sure, but he seemed the most likely to find his way out of his parents' reach. Mark was darting about with endless energy. At first, he splashed his feet in the water. Then he ran and climbed on a fallen log. After that, he and his father chased each other over the rocks. And finally, he made one more trip to the water line, picking up small stones to throw into the stream. He was a lively, happy, and active child, like almost every other boy his age. Mark's bubbly personality even brought out a little more adventure in his sister Rosie, who was much more reserved and shy. If anyone was going to explore on his own, it would be Mark. He was the cat's next target. After a quick bite to eat and a long drink of water, the group started heading back down the trail. Mark kept his eyes on the ground for the first hour or two, trying to spy on a peanut. He started to think that the rodents had found his trail after all, and his little heart sank with disappointment. But not for long. Just when he'd given up hope, he saw the near-perfect line of treats start up where his bag had run empty. With an exciting whoop, he ran forward, intending to follow the peanuts all the way to the car. David smiled. He'd been aware of what his son had been doing with his bag of snacks, and instead of telling Mark off for wasting food, he allowed him to have his fun. That's what the woods were about, after all, making your own adventures. So he let Mark run ahead, knowing he'd stay on the trail where the peanuts were. The lion that had been sneaking behind them quickened her pace when the boy raced away from his parents. Just ahead of the trail, there was a bend that would obscure him from the 3 adults. If she got there quick enough, she could cut him off and have him out of there before the others even caught up to Mark. Silent and quick, she used the rocks and fallen branches to avoid stepping on noisy, dry leaves. She sprinted past Mark, so close that if he raised his eyes from his line of peanuts, he'd have seen her. But he was utterly focused and didn't catch the brown blur that passed by ahead of him. As Mark ran further away from his parents, David called for him to slow down and wait for them. But Mark wasn't listening. When his son disappeared past the curve in the path ahead, David sighed and jogged forward, leaving his wife, daughter, and Dina behind to catch up with Mark. By the time Mark turned the bend, the feline was already in position, and David was still many yards behind them. Crouched behind some bushes, she heard the thump of the bigger man's steps as he jogged closer. She'd spent the whole day being patient. This was her best and probably her only chance to get at the child. If she didn't act now, she'd be hungry for another day. Then Mark ran by, his head still down, looking for more peanuts. The predator leapt at him. The weight of her belly barely slowed her down when she was airborne, thanks to the incredibly muscular legs that propelled her up and forward. Mark saw the movement and jerked his head up. With claws already extended and her body arching through the air, the mountain lion fell on him. The 88-pound cat crushed him into the gravel path. Mark opened his mouth to scream out, but the cat already had its teeth around his throat, closing his airway and blocking any air from passing over his voice box. Her claws enveloped him, digging trenches into his back. Piercing pain ran through Mark's skinny frame. His neck and back felt like they were on fire. If he could have gotten a sound out, he would have been screaming in agony and terror. The mountain lion increased her grip on his windpipe, and Mark heard the snap of his neck reverberate inside his head before his vision switched off and he suddenly went limp. The mountain lion knew instantly that the child was dead. His muscles went completely placid beneath her when she felt the crack of his neck between her jaws. From behind the bend, the sound of sneakers hitting the path was almost upon her, so she released her hold on Mark and grabbed him by his dark hair instead. She dragged his body off the path and into the bushes that she'd just leapt out of. But before she could get the boy out of sight, the father came around the corner. His sneakers came to a sudden halt when he saw his only son being dragged across the trail by the huge predator. She met his eyes, and her gaze brought David out of his shock. With a scream of terror and sorrow, David stormed at the lion. Thoughts of his own safety didn't even register with him. Only the life of his son mattered now, no matter what the monster was that had Mark in its claws. The cat did not expect the man to reach them so soon, and she certainly didn't expect him to make the noise that escaped his mouth. The next moment he rushed at her, startling her enough to make her let go of Mark's scalp, taking a patch of skin and brown hair with her as she turned her clumsy body around and fled into the trees. David's screams alarmed Kathy and Dina, and they ran down the path, leaving their conversation hanging in midair. Rosie was riding on her mother's hip, and she held on for dear life when her mother suddenly sprinted forward. Kathy found David crouched beside the terrible sight of her young son lying bleeding on the ground. And even with all of her medical background as a nurse, she knew that the severe angle of his neck meant that it was too late. She still ran forward, shoving Rosie into Dina's arms. Kathy ripped David's shirt right off his back and wrapped it around Mark's torn-open neck, but the blood no longer flowed with the steady pump of a heartbeat. It just seeped out steadily. While Kathy attempted CPR and applied pressure to her boy's neck, Dina was already running ahead with Rosie bouncing on her hip. She found a group of mountain bikers less than a mile ahead, and they rode in to get some help. But by the time Dina returned, Kathy and David were sitting numb with horror, no longer struggling to bring Mark back. They eventually realized that there was nothing they could do for Mark, with a broken neck and the gashes on his throat. Both wounds were fatal on their own, and he was starting to lose his body heat and develop that unmistakable gray tinge to his skin that came with death. For the next hour, they sat waiting for help to arrive. Dina held Rosie's head in her hair to spare the child the sight of her dead big brother. The bikers had managed to find 2 park rangers, and they rode their off-road Jeep to the scene. One of them stayed behind while the other escorted Kathy, David, Dina, and Rosie back to the lot to await emergency services that were already on their way. The man who stayed behind took off his jacket and placed it over Mark's remains. He couldn't handle looking at the child's blank eyes and the raw wound on his neck a second longer. Mark's body was removed from the scene, and searchers went out to look for the mountain lion. It took a professional tracker 3 days to find her. The cat was killed with 2 bullets and taken in for an autopsy, though no one expected any of Mark's remains to be in her system, given that she'd only managed to tear away a small piece of his scalp. But they did find the 2 cubs inside her belly. probably only days away from being born. But with the child's killer dead, the family could begin to heal after their only son, Mark Medena, met his terrifying final affliction. Nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Range, 30 miles east of Seattle, lies Northbend. It is a residential community surrounded by woodland and mountains. Locals and visitors can enjoy hiking, fishing, climbing, river sports, wildlife, and mountain biking within the city limits. This is exactly where 32-year-old S.J. Brooks headed on Saturday, May 19, 2018. He and his 31-year-old friend, Isaac Saterbaum, went for a bike ride through the woodland. They followed one of the popular trails. It wound around the trees, often wide enough for the two of them to ride side by side, talking as they went. But the two of them weren't alone. There was a cougar nearby, but this wasn't just any cougar. It was an exceptionally dangerous one. A young male, emaciated and starving. It was looking for an easy meal. It may have been suffering from disease, poisoning, or an injury, but it had reverted to desperate measures, out during daylight hours, and in territory it was not familiar with. It considered the two young men as potential prey. In the mid-morning light, the cougar could hear the two men coming closer. They were enjoying the outdoors. S.J. was an avid biker. He had worked as a bike mechanic in the past, and his love for the sport led him to co-found a bike community called Friends on Bikes, Seattle. This was where people of all shapes, sizes, and backgrounds came together to enjoy the outdoors on bikes. It brought those from minorities such as trans, femme, non-binary people of color together, and was something he was proud of. When they reached a corner in the track, the two of them heard a rustle in the bushes and looked behind them. There, amongst the undergrowth, was a beige-brown cougar. He had been watching them intently as they came within striking distance, and then he launched his attack as they cycled past. He was hot on their heels, chasing them through the woods. As tempting as it was to try and outpace the cougar, the two men knew better. Instinct was telling them to make a break for it, but their heads and the knowledge they had of these wild cats told them to stay still. They squeezed the brakes and jumped off their bikes, turning around to face the approaching cat. Cougars are generalist hypercarnivores, feeding on a range of large mammals including mule deer, white-tailed deer, elk, moose, mountain goats, and bighorn sheep. They also opportunistically take smaller animals such as rodents, rabbits, and birds. Although they are capable of sprinting, these cats typically ambush their prey. They stalk their prey from behind. The cougar you don't see is the one that is hunting you. They will then leap onto their prey from behind and deliver a fatal bite to the back of the neck. The cougar's eyes were large and brown, reflecting the mid-morning sun. The shoulder blade protruded through the skin as it half stalked, half ran at the two men. They stood with their bikes standing between them and the cougar. It came closer. They made noise, typically something that will scare away the usually timid cats, but it didn't work. Their shouting had no effect on the hungry predator. It continued to advance. When it was within feet of them, Isaac swung his bike around to hit the cougar. The back wheel made contact with the cat and it backed away. The two men watched as the cougar began to slope off. They breathed heavily, both letting out sighs of relief, looking at each other and beginning to talk about how crazy that encounter had been. But just as they let their guard down, the cougar came back for more. It was bold and determined. It rushed at them and leapt onto Isaac. He was floored. The huge cat had his head in its jaws and began to crush his skull, and then began to shake him violently. He felt like his neck might snap. S.J. hit the cat, but it didn't release his friend. Isaac wrestled back. He was desperately trying to pry open the cougar's jaws, trying to pull his head free. He refused to give up. The powerful animal stood over him whilst he grappled with its face, kicking with his legs and gritting his teeth as he fought for his life. S.J. knew he needed to get help and began to run away, but when he began to flee, the cougar noticed out of the corner of its eye. It looked up and released Isaac. He pulled his head out of its jaws. The cat's attention turned to S.J. Its killer instinct kicked in as it saw its prey running away from the scene. It immediately ran after him, pouncing on him at the last second and securing him in its jaws. It then began dragging the man, kicking and screaming, into the undergrowth. It was now time for Isaac to get help. He pulled out his mobile phone, but there was no reception. He jumped onto his bike and sped back down the track he had cycled only moments before. He held his phone out in front of him, praying for the signal bars to appear on the screen, but they didn't, and his heart thumped loudly in his chest as he tore along the path. He needed SJ to hold on. He was getting help, but his friend needed to hold on just a bit longer. He himself was in bad shape, blood pouring down his face from the gashes on his head. He was battered and bruised, panicked and in shock, but he plowed on. It wasn't until 2 miles later that his phone finally pinged with reception. He screeched to a halt and dialed 911. His desperate call cut out after just a few seconds, but he called them back. When he was on the phone, making a desperate plea to the 911 dispatcher, a passerby offered to help. He handed them the phone, and they described the state Isaac was in, conscious but with serious lacerations to his face and head. Emergency services were dispatched and rushed to the scene. He directed them up the trail to where he had last seen SJ. Isaac was also suffering from severe injuries and was flown to Harborview Medical Center and treated for his wounds. All the while, he was hoping and praying that his friend had made it. It took the rescue team 30 minutes to get to the place of the attack. They found the cougar. It was standing in woodlands just off the main trail in what looked like its den. They could see its beige body, long but thin, its ribs visible under its skin. It turned to look at them. They noticed that it was standing astride a body that was partially covered in undergrowth. It was an attempt by the cougar to conceal its prey from other predators in the area. When the cougar saw the authorities approaching, it scarpered, leaving behind SJ's body. Emergency services assessed SJ, but it was clear he could not be revived. He had succumbed to his terrible injuries. Agents from the Washington Department of Fish and Game spent hours tracking down the cougar. Eventually, at 4 p.m., they had managed to follow its trail. It led them through the rugged woodland, where they found it huddled up a tree, staring down at them. The rarity of the attack and the way in which it pursued the two men, despite doing everything they should have done, made this cougar exceptionally dangerous. For whatever reason, it was unpredictable and likely to strike again. The decision was made to shoot it. It came crashing down to the ground where it could be examined by experts. It was a young male, 3 or 4 years old, but it was severely underweight. For its size, it should have weighed around 140 pounds, just over 60 kilograms, but instead it weighed just 100 pounds, 45 kilograms. It was sent off for a necropsy at the veterinary lab at Washington State University. SJ and Isaac were incredibly unlucky. The two of them had acted exactly as they should have done. They resisted the urge to try and race away from the cougar, and instead stopped their bikes and faced it. They made loud noises and stood together, standing tall and not backing down. Usually these things are enough to scare off cougars. They are renowned for being incredibly timid, and it is rare that people see them, as they often slink away at the first sign of people. This just goes to show how desperate this cougar must have been. In a state with around 2,000 cougars, SJ was only the second victim of a fatal attack in Washington in 94 years. But encounters with cougars are becoming more common. This is largely due to 2 reasons. Firstly, their numbers are making a significant comeback from the bounty hunting years during the last century. And secondly, people are encroaching more and more on their habitat. Territories are cut in half by roads, woodlands are demolished to make way for ranches, and towns and cities are forever expanding into the surrounding countryside. It is no wonder that cougars are struggling to find food and remain concealed from the human population. Experts recommend the following if you do find yourself face to face with a cougar. Immediately pick up small children, stop, speak firmly, and slowly back away. Do not make sudden movements or run, as these might trigger its innate prey drive. Try to appear as big as possible by raising your hands, standing on a tree stump, or opening your jacket. Keep your eyes on the animal and become more assertive if it doesn't back off. And if it does attack, fight back, or you might just end up meeting your terrifying final affliction. 30-year-old Francis Frost lived in Canmore in Alberta, Canada, situated 50 miles west of Calgary and near the border of Banff National Park. The area boasts world-class trails for cross-country skiers. One of those cross-country skiers was Frances. She and her family frequented the trails during the winter. A particular favorite was the Cascade Fire Road. She had lived in her parents' condo in Canmore for 5 years with her family, which included Frances, her brother Ken, and sister Amy. They spent Christmas there together every year, enjoying the beautiful winter slopes as a family. This year would be their last. During their stay, her parents had been out on the cross-country trail twice, each time describing the beauty of it and the perfect conditions for skiing. But Frances hadn't been able to leave the home to join them. Over the Christmas period in 2000, she was plagued by a cold. Only in the new year did she start to feel better, and on January 2, 2001, she decided to head outside for some fresh air. Her parents headed back to their home in Edmonton. Frances gave each of them a warm hug goodbye. That same afternoon, she ventured out onto the Cascade Fire Road to experience the perfect conditions her parents had been raving about. She clipped on her cross-country skis and set off from the car park. It felt good to be outside and to breathe the icy air after being ill for so long. She could feel her body reviving itself as she glided over the white snow. She beamed at some locals she knew as she slid past, but Frances was gliding into danger. There had been a spike in cougar activity in the area recently. The elk had been drawn nearer to town and the mountain lions had followed. That very same day, hours before Frances's outing, a cougar had stalked an Alaskan husky outside its home. At 3 a.m. and under cover of darkness, the cougar crept closer to the unsuspecting dog and pounced on it at the last second. There was a loud shriek from the dog, and the commotion as the two animals tussled woke the dog's owner. When they rushed outside, they managed to scare the cougar off and tend to their wounded pooch. The dog lived to bark another day. But more was to come. 3 hours later, just after 6 a.m., Cheryl Hyde took her schnauzer for a walk. It was dark outside. The air was cold. The only sound was the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional roar as a car rolled past. But in the stillness of the early morning, a predator lurked. It was on the hunt. When Cheryl thought she heard a footstep behind her, she wheeled around. There, to her shock, was a cougar following her. It wouldn't take its eyes off her. The faster she walked, the faster it walked, but it was gaining on her. She tried to remain calm and resist the urge to run. Then she came to a dead end. She backed up against a neighbor's fence, turning to face the cougar. It hissed at her and crunched down low. Unable to move and pinned up against the fence, Cheryl screamed for help. Gary Doyle raced outside and saw the cougar just 3 feet from Cheryl in a crouched position, ready to strike. Gary ran at the cat and scared it off. It had been a lucky escape, and Gary received an award for his bravery. The Cascade Fire Road that Frances was skiing along was a relatively easy route. It was a straightforward out-and-back track that was deemed suitable for all families, often receiving early-season snow in the winter and the first to be track set. It was popular and could be busy. The trail wound through the conifer forest along the Cascade River. A narrow wooden bridge took skiers over to the other side of the river and onto a ranger cabin. Many turned around at the bridge, but a few continue, making the route harder and much longer. Frances had set off just after noon. She had turned around on her route as intended and was heading back to her car. It had been a pleasant run with few people along the trail, but now, just 300 meters from her car, she was being stalked by a cougar. It had sensed Frances whilst out hunting and had homed in on her position. Now it lay in wait for her, crouched behind a tree that lined the track. It didn't move a muscle. It didn't make a sound. Its ears pricked as it heard the sound of skis sliding over the glistening snow, the sound growing louder. Frances wasn't only a keen outdoors woman and nature lover, she was also well known in the performing arts. She was a dancer at Edmonton's Ballet North Dance School and Performing Company, and was honored to hold the role of dancer in residence at the Banff Center. Hidden in the shadows, the cougar waited for the opportune moment to pounce. Just as Frances had passed by, It leapt onto her back, its muscular limbs latching onto the young woman, its mouth agape. The 60-kilogram, 130-pound feline knocked Frances off her feet and sent her flying to the ground. Her face hit the icy snow, but she died in a matter of seconds. There was no way she could fight off the 2-meter male once it had locked its jaws onto the back of her neck. She may not have even known what had hit her. The cougar then stood, panting over Frances's lifeless body. The swishing sound of skis appeared once more. It was another skier on the trail. He spotted the cougar and Frances on the ground and sped off to get help. As he passed other people, he warned them about the cougar and ushered them away in the opposite direction. Panic gripped the community as news of the tragedy spread. Park ranger arrived at the scene minutes later, where the cougar was still protecting its kill. They raised a rifle and pulled the trigger. The cougar fell to the ground. The attack made headlines the next day, but the young woman couldn't be identified. Her father had picked up the national newspaper back home in Edmonton. He couldn't believe the headline stating that a 30-year-old woman had been killed by a cougar in Banff. His heart leapt in his chest, and he called out to his wife. The two of them read the article in disbelief. Terrified that it might be their daughter, Mr. Frost called her. There was no answer. He left a message. "Franny, I know it's not you. Give me a call." Frances hadn't been carrying any formal identification on her. All that she had in one of her pockets was a card from the Banff Center, where she was a dancer in residence. Police managed to find out who she was, and that evening they headed to Edmonton. There was a knock on her parents' door. It was the police, coming to deliver the terrible news. They had had their suspicions because the description of the woman in the newspaper had sounded just like Frances. They had been trying to get in touch with her all day, but had failed. Her mother knew how tired Frances had been after suffering from the seasonal flu over the Christmas period, and has since wondered whether that played any part in what happened. Had the cougar sensed that Frances was easy prey, and perhaps in a weakened state? Nobody can know for sure why the cougar attacked Frances. She had tragically been in the wrong place at the wrong time. An hour or two earlier or later may have resulted in a different ending. It's rare for cougars to attack people unprovoked. A year and a half earlier, 150 habituated elk had been moved from the area to allow the ecosystem to recover. They provided food for the cougars, so the attack could have been driven by hunger. But there were known to still be significant numbers of elk in the area. A recent wolf pack had settled in the area and may have been competing with the cougars for elk, driving cougars closer to the town. Even so, it still remained an incredibly unusual incident. It was not thought to be the same cougar involved with the incidents earlier in the day. Head ranger of Banff National Park, Ian Syme, said that a daylight attack by a cougar is rare. An attack on a human is even more rare, and a lethal attack on a human is unheard of in Alberta. This was a first. Locals and visitors alike were shocked by the attack. Officials told people to walk their dogs during daylight hours and to stay on well-lit roads. Those who ventured out into the national park to hike or ski should do so only in groups. Families kept their children indoors immediately after the tragedy, and some were too afraid to leave their homes. Until his failing health caught up with him, Frances's father and mother skied the Cascade Fire Road every year in memory of their daughter. Despite the increase of cougars in the area, many residents still ski the exact path where Frances met her terrifying final affliction. At just 8 years old, Jeremy Williams attended his local Cayucit Elementary School, along with his 4-year-old brother Daniel. They were members of the native Cayucit people. Their father also taught at the school in the isolated community on British Columbia's Vancouver Island. Belonging to a community steeped in tradition and rich in culture, Jeremy and Daniel were 2 of the 300 First Nation people living in the village. The rural, isolated community was situated 140 miles northwest of Victoria, surrounded by beautiful wilderness. Cayucit is the most northwesterly contemporary settlement of the Nootka-speaking natives. It is a fishing village. The food of the ocean has provided for the community for generations. The First Nations people came there over 4,000 years ago. They were drawn by the rich sea life, natural resources, mild climate, and the beautiful surroundings. But in those surroundings were hidden dangers. Wild animals lurked. Most turned away at the first sight of a human, but for others, they were bold and brazen. They posed a real risk, especially to those who wandered off alone. The close proximity of the school to the wilderness was a concern for parents. They had repeatedly asked school governors to erect a fence around the school and its grounds. They knew that wild animals were common in the area, and they believed that it was only a matter of time before an attack on the school children. Sadly, they were right. During the recent weeks, there had been more and more cougar sightings on Vancouver Island. The cats were naturally curious animals, and some had little fear of humans. They approached walkers, cyclists, and even wildlife rangers. The advice was always to stand still, wave your arms above your head, and shout. Never turn your back on a cougar and try and throw something at it. Any small children should be picked up. Typically, they will run away. Usually, they are just interested in something you're carrying rather than you, such as food in your backpack. But if they see you as the prey, then that is a whole different story. A mountain lion that is stalking you is not merely curious, they want a meal. On a Tuesday morning in May 1992, Jeremy was playing with his brother Daniel and their two friends in the school playground. Their father, who was one of the teachers at the school, was inside the building. He could hear the children playing and would sometimes look out through the windows and catch his two boys running around with the others. But he wasn't the only one watching the children playing that morning. A cougar had been drawn to the shrieks and cries of the young children as they played outside during recess. Jeremy sat down on a grassy bank on the edge of the playground, whilst the other children continued to run around behind him. He looked out at the surrounding woodland, but he failed to spot the camouflaged cat in the undergrowth. The cougar locked its eyes onto the small boy. It was a female, just a yearling. She was likely hunting on her own for one of the first times. Mountain lions typically remain with their mothers until between the ages of 14 to 21 months. As a yearling, she can't have been independent for very long. She was an inexperienced hunter, but an opportunistic one of the most dangerous of her kind. Cougars are hypercarnivores, meaning that they only eat meat. In Yellowstone National Park, they compete with wolves for elk and deer. Elsewhere, they also hunt smaller mammals such as raccoons, porcupines, and wild turkeys. But they typically hunt at night or during dusk and dawn. So why was this one out in the day? Perhaps it had had an unsuccessful night on the hunt. Perhaps it was very, very hungry. The cougar crouched down low, her belly inches from the ground. Slowly, she crept forwards in the undergrowth, her footsteps silent on the ground, her eyes unblinking. Then she made a dash for it, suddenly running from the woodland towards the boy. She covered the open ground between Jeremy and herself in a second. A flash of brown caught Jeremy's eye, and he looked up and screamed as he saw the 60-pound, 27-kilogram mountain lion launch itself at him. He didn't have time to get up and run. It jumped on top of him, instinctively going for the neck. Her claws dug into his body, and the long canines pierced his throat as it mauled him. The other children screamed and all made a run for the school building. Some rushed inside, shouting for help. They knew their friend was in serious trouble. It was pandemonium. Jeremy was trying to fight back, but he was too small in comparison to the wild cat. He didn't stand a chance. The weight of her body pinned him down, and when she closed her jaws around his throat, he had just seconds to live. Kevin Williams, Jeremy's father, heard the chaos outside and ran to the playground. There, he saw his eldest son underneath the beige-brown cat, his head in its jaws. He ran at the mountain lion, yelling and shouting, trying desperately to distract it and scare it away. He tried to find something to throw at it as he rushed forwards, but time was running out. Although only seconds passed, in reality, time seemed to stand still. The attack seemed to go on forever, with Kevin feeling powerless to stop it. Then the school janitor, also hearing the terrified screams of the school children, came running outside with his rifle. He lifted it, took aim and fired a single shot. The cougar collapsed on the ground next to the youngster, but it was too late. It had already delivered its fatal bite, and there was nothing Kevin could do for his son. He held the boy, limp in his arms, whilst his 4-year-old son, Daniel, Jeremy's younger brother, watched on. The death of one of their own shook the close-knit Cayuquit community. It was a tragedy that could so easily have been avoided. Richard Leo, a Cayuquit Indian chief, told the authorities that parents were furious at the school board for not protecting the children from the threat of wild animals. There weren't just cougars out there were bears and wolves. Richard said that no pupils would be returning to the school until they had assurances that a fence will be erected around its grounds. Being surrounded by prime cougar and bear habitat, their children needed to be kept safe. A dozen children were in the playground that day. They witnessed one of their friends being killed right before their eyes. And for Daniel, he had watched in horror as his older brother was mauled just feet from where he stood. Professional counseling was provided for those children, and there was an outpouring of support from the local community. It was a tragedy that will never be forgotten by those in Cayuquit. There are some 4,000 cougars in the whole of Canada, 3,500 of which are found in British Columbia. Vancouver Island has the highest concentration of cougars in the world, with around 800 calling the island home. In the past 100 years, 5 people have lost their lives to the mountain lions in British Columbia. Surprisingly, all but one of these occurred on Vancouver Island. During the same period, 29 non-fatal attacks occurred in British Columbia, 20 of which were on the island. The majority of these were on children under the age of 16. Although these attacks are devastating for all involved, they are actually exceedingly rare. But it is the elusiveness of the cougars that makes them so terrifying, knowing that they are out there and that they are born predators with the ability to take down a 600-pound moose. Most Canadians will never see one, but for those that do, it often comes along with their terrifying final affliction. Talon and Wyatt Brooks knew the woods of Georgetown like the back of their hand. The brothers had been hunting here with their fathers since they could remember. Before either of them were allowed to lift a rifle, Mr. Brooks made sure that they could track, skin, and process every single inch of the animal that they were after. Only when they were 15 did they first get to shoot down a buck. The Brooks boys learned from the best, and they lived for the wilderness. Even outside of hunting season, they'd still go camping. Talon, now 21, had a packed schedule with college classes and keeping a part-time job. But on the rare occasion that he could get a weekend off, he'd stop by his childhood home to pick up his 18-year-old brother and their father for some time outside. On the 23rd of March, 2024, Mr. Brooks was held up at work, but Talon had a lucky break. He wouldn't have to go into work for the night shift, but Talon and Wyatt didn't mind. It would have been nicer to have their father with them, but they could get along without him just fine. It wouldn't be the first time they headed off on their own, after all. While the snow was still on the ground, the only thing available to hunt was the wild boars. If all went well, the boys would bring back 1 or 2 boars home to process, filling the freezers nicely until spring came and the bigger bucks were open for hunting again. But mostly they were there for the shed antlers that were all over the place at that time of the year. They arrived at one of their favorite camping spots, hidden just off the road in the woods. They spent the first hour chatting merrily as they set up camp, got everything ready for that night's fire, and set up dinner. They were planning on going back home the very next day, so the fire was more for warmth than cooking purposes. They had plenty of food for 2 strapping young men packed for them by their mother that morning. Since the afternoon was still young, they decided to head out to see if they could get 1 or 2 pigs before nightfall, and sure enough, they got a fantastic boar within 2 hours. They even managed to find 3 good-sized antlers, too. The rest of the afternoon was spent dressing the pig out in the field and carrying it back to their campsite. They left the entrails out for the scavengers to clear up for them. Wyatt was the one who brought the boar down, something he wasn't going to let his older brother live down anytime soon. They cleaned up in a nearby stream and headed off to bed for the night. While they slept, the guts and hooves that they left behind for the scavengers attracted its fair share of critters. Among the voles and a lone coyote, there was also a mountain lion. She chased the rest away from what little was left, but the scraps were barely enough to fill her belly. The predator tracked the scent of the pig all the way back to the campsite where the boys slept, but she kept her distance. The smell of the carcass was tantalizing, but within that delicious smell was also the odor of fire and humans. She nearly built up enough courage to go up to the camp, but just then Wyatt stepped out of the tent to relieve himself. She slunk back into the woods and decided to wait until the men made a move in the morning. If they left, then she could get close enough to make away with a piece or a whole carcass. The night dragged on, but sure enough, the morning dawned, and the boys were outside as soon as the sun came up. The watcher retreated a little farther back, never taking her eyes off them. She'd taken shelter right up against a boulder where a thicket of brushes grew high enough to shield her from sight. When they'd finished a quick breakfast, checked on the carcass, and made sure that their rifles were in working order, the boys headed out again. But the cat didn't bank on them heading off straight into the woods toward her. She knew that the humans usually kept to the pathways, but now, with Wyatt in the lead, they were making a beeline toward her hiding place. The men were fast approaching, and the nervous cat let out a low growl. At first, Wyatt thought it was a truck passing by. They were close enough to the road that it would be possible. He simply kept walking, not thinking anything of it. He came just 5 feet from the cat's hiding spot before he even saw her. But by then, it was too late. Mad with fear, hunger, and unwilling to be cornered by anyone or anything, she leapt out of the bushes before Wyatt could even take up his rifle. Her claws were unsheathed, and she pounced with deadly accuracy. If it weren't for Wyatt's heavy winter jacket, her claws would have ripped his chest to shreds. The same couldn't be said for his uncovered face. The animal sank her teeth into the soft tissue of his cheek, knocking him over with the force of her full weight flying into him. Talon managed to get the chance to raise his firearm, but his little brother and his attacker were intertwined with each other that he would have shot Wyatt if he attempted it. Instead, Talon did the only thing he could do. He threw down his gun and launched himself at the screaming chaos of writhing limbs and blood. Talon tackled the beast like he would have hit an opponent on the football field. This time the mountain lion was the one being catapulted through the air. In midair, before they even hit the forest floor, Talon yelled at his brother to run. Wyatt, holding the flap that used to be his cheek to his face, ran through the woods half blind. He didn't know it yet, but his left eye was somewhere beneath his crushed cheekbone. With Talon's screams and the cat's wild cries behind him, Wyatt reached the camp in minutes. He grabbed the nearest phone from the tent, and with his bloody fingers slipping on the screen, he managed to dial 911. Wyatt didn't remember it later, but he did manage to relay to the operator what was going on and what their location was. But then, with the woman still on the line, he passed out cold, finally giving in to the shock, pain, and fear that just overloaded his system. That's where emergency services found him lying at the door of their little two-man tent. Wyatt didn't regain consciousness as he was driven away in the ambulance. The team that stayed behind didn't have to search long to find Talon. Just a few meters away from the camp, they found him, unmoving on the ground, with a cougar standing over him. The officer's shots rang through the air, and she bolted back into the trees. They were not aiming for the cat. Like Talon, they didn't want to risk shooting the man instead of the cat, but it wouldn't have mattered anyway. Talon's throat had been ripped out, and his entire upper body was so destroyed that it was evident that she'd started eating at his soft tissues before they'd even arrived. The trackers found her before the day was out. The cat was euthanized, and her necropsy was done mostly to satisfy the necessary paperwork. When they found her, Talon and Wyatt's blood was still wet on her muzzle. There's no question that they got the right cat. Wyatt is still looking at more surgeries than any boy should have to face in their lifetime. He's stable and expected to make a full recovery. The entire left side of his face will have to be reconstructed, and there's no word out yet on whether or not they'll be able to save his eye. And unfortunately, he'll be confined to the hospital for the next few weeks, so he won't be able to attend his one and only brother's funeral. Talon sacrificed his life to save his brothers, but tragically, it resulted in his terrifying final affliction. In October 2018, a 55-year-old woman by the name of Diana Bober went missing. Her family became concerned when they hadn't heard from her in a while. The last they knew was that Diana had headed to Welch's in Oregon. The village is situated 40 miles southeast of Portland and near the Mount Hood National Forest. This forest covers the base of Mount Hood, Oregon's highest mountain. It is a place that is popular with hikers and campers. It offers a beautiful wilderness set in rugged terrain. With over 1 million acres of countryside, it is a great place to explore. It's covered in forest, waterfalls, glacial creeks, and alpine meadows. Over 4 million people visit the National Forest every year to enjoy the outdoors. Diana drove her car towards the forested area and parked it near the Zigzag Ranger Station. This was where the Hunchback Trail began. It was an undulating trail which promised incredible scenery and great viewpoints along the way. The trail runs for 9 miles before heading back down the same path. The hike was steep and rocky in places, and in the first 2 miles, the path rose 2,000 feet in elevation to the first viewpoint. This was where Diana's hike came to a sudden and tragic end. The rough and rugged terrain set amongst the forest was prime mountain lion or cougar habitat. These cats inhabit North, Central, and South America and are ambush predators. They hunt their prey using their stealth and agility. Although they can sprint at great speeds in pursuit of prey, they more typically pounce on an animal. No one knows exactly what happened to Diana, but it was likely she was stalked and then killed by a mountain lion. Diana was fit and was used to the outdoors. She enjoyed hiking. On this particular occasion, she set out alone. Walking along the trail, the mountain lion would have picked up her scent. If it was hunting for prey, then it would have homed in on Diana as she moved along the rocky path, placing each paw on the ground carefully and silently. Watching from a distance, the cat followed Diana, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Perhaps Diana paused briefly in her ascent to take a breath or a photo, or maybe she knelt down to tie a shoelace, making herself small and vulnerable. Whatever happened, the attack would have been sudden and unexpected. It is likely that Diana did not see the mountain lion before it was upon her, and too late. Based on what survivors have said about other mountain lion attacks, it would have pounced on Diana from behind or from a blind spot. Males can weigh up to 160 pounds and females just over 100 pounds. Being hit by one of these large cats would send you crashing to the ground. In an instant, the cougar would be on top of you without you even catching a glimpse of it. They typically deliver a fatal bite to the neck of their prey. This either suffocates the larger prey animals or breaks the neck of smaller ones. Being floored by the mountain lion, she scrabbled about, trying to defend herself, kicking and punching as the mountain lion tried to deliver its fatal bite. Through flashes of beige-brown fur, she could see the cougar's sharp teeth. She could hear it growling as it mercilessly carried out the attack. Her hands were bitten as she tried desperately to push the cat away, but the cougar kept up its ferocious attack. Although it was relatively small for a mountain lion, it was strong and powerful. Fighting back would have been exhausting and difficult. It managed to bite her repeatedly around the back of her neck as Diana thrashed around, trying to escape. But then, tragically, the mountain lion was able to secure a solid grip around Diana's neck, and it bit down powerfully. A bite force of approximately 400 psi and canines 2 inches long. make these cats formidable predators. Diana's neck was found to be broken, and she sadly died from her injuries. It would have been a brutal and terrifying attack, one that would have caught Diana completely by surprise. When her family notified the authorities that she was missing, they immediately set up a search party. Her car was located at the ranger station at one end of the Hunchback Trail. The search team followed the trail up through the wooded region. A week after Diana was last seen by family and 2 days after discovering her car, her body was found. She had made it only 2 miles along the trail before being attacked. Her body was found 300 feet off the trail and down a steep incline. Her hands and the back of her neck were covered in at least 12 puncture wounds. Her neck was also broken. It was a tragic finding for Diana's family. They described her as an avid hiker and outdoors person. She had died doing what she loved, but locals and officials were shocked by the attack. Typically, mountain lions are shy and will move away from people when they sense they are near. Occasionally, they attack lone adults and small children, but this is rare. Following the finding of Diana's body and concluding that she had died from an animal attack, wildlife officials set up cameras along the Hunchback Trail. These motion sensors cameras would hopefully provide evidence of a predator in the area. 3 days later, they had their footage. It showed a female cougar close to where Diana had been killed. Suspecting this individual to be responsible for Diana's death, state police and search dogs set off to catch it. It wasn't far from the trail where Diana had been hiking. When it heard the search team closing in, it tried to hide. The team managed to track it down, and it scarpered up a tree. Police then shot and killed it. The cat fell to the ground with a heavy thump. Then it was taken away for examination. The cougar was delivered to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Forensics Lab in Ashland. Technicians tried to match DNA from the cougar to that found on Diana, but they weren't able to. Too much time had passed since the attack, and rainwater would likely have washed away any evidence from Diana's body. The female cougar they killed weighed in at 64.5 pounds. This was a relatively small cat, but it was still strong and powerful and was able to deliver a fatal bite. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife were unclear what the motive for the attack was. The mountain lion was not emaciated and appeared to be in good shape. It didn't look as though the attack had been made out of desperation for a meal, and when tested for rabies, her result came back negative. Maybe Diana startled the cougar, and instead of fleeing like many cougars, it attacked her. It is also possible, of course, that the cougar was out hunting when she homed her senses in on the lone hiker. However, she did not eat Diana nor stash her away for later. The sheriff's office stated that there were about 6,000 cougars or mountain lions in the state of Oregon. They received hundreds of complaints every year about livestock and pets being attacked by them, but no one has ever been killed by a wild mountain lion in Oregon before, at least not to their knowledge. The only known incident of a mountain lion attack in Oregon was the death of 36-year-old Renee Radzawan Chapman. She was head keeper at Wildcat Haven Sanctuary. This is a nonprofit that rescues wild cats, often those that have been illegally kept as pets. The young mother was tragically mauled to death inside the cat's cage back in 2013, despite expressing concerns to her boss about working alone with the cougars. Besides this attack, Diana would be the first to take place naturally in the wild. Over the past 100 years, there have been 126 cougar attacks in North America. 27 of these have proved fatal. It seems Diana was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And although hiking in the great outdoors always carries with it an element of risk, no one could have predicted the attack on Diana that led to her terrifying final affliction.
Cindy Parolin was a crisis counselor at Princeton Hospital, British Columbia. She was also a mother of 4. As an adventurous 36-year-old, Cindy was often taking her children, ages 13, 11, 10, and 6, on adventures in the great outdoors. Princeton is a mining and ranching town, 120 miles east of Vancouver. There is plenty of wilderness to explore and hunt in, and on this occasion, on August 19, 1996, the family were off camping. Cindy and 3 of her children were riding their horses into Similkameen backcountry in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains. This rough and rugged terrain is home to eagles, deer, and of course, the mountain lion. The family headed along one of the many horse trails. Their destination was an isolated campsite where they were to meet Cindy's other son and husband. The children were excited. They were seasoned riders and had ridden many times before, but always loved the thrill of a new adventure. During hunting season, Cindy would carry a rifle with her, strapping it to her saddle. This time, however, with hunting season still weeks away, Cindy had left her rifle at home. The sun was rising high in the sky. The young family chatted to each other as their horses plodded along the off-road tracks. The air was warm and the scenery was beautiful. They came upon a slight curve in the track. The horses hesitated. Cindy gave her horse a gentle nudge to carry on, but it refused. Stroking the horse's velvet soft neck, Cindy looked back at the others. They too stood still, flicking their heads up and down and dancing a little on the spot. The horses were anxious. Someone or something had spooked them. Cindy looked around. There was nothing there. A gentle breeze filled the air. The horses snorted and shifted uneasily on their feet. Then suddenly, from the nearby bushes, something darted at them. Cindy heard a crashing through the undergrowth and turned to see a mountain lion launch itself at her youngest boy. It narrowly missed 6-year-old Stephen and instead grabbed onto the horse's neck. The mountain lion fell to the floor, scrambled about, and proceeded to attack once more. It leapt at Stephen, clawing at his legs. His shoes and socks were torn off. The horse reared up in fright, knocking Stephen to the floor. In a wild panic, Stephen's horse bolted, and the mountain lion jumped on top of the dazed 6-year-old. All Cindy and the others could see was Stephen's legs kicking and thrashing about underneath the animal. Cindy screamed at the lion. She jumped off her horse and snapped a branch from a nearby tree. Wielding the branch in her hand, she raised it above her head and brought it crashing down on the cat's back. Again and again, she continually whacked the huge cat as it mauled her young son. The mountain lion quickly wheeled around, facing Cindy. It released its grip on the boy, and in seconds, it had pounced on top of Cindy, knocking her to the ground. She yelled at the other 2 children to rescue Stephen. They leapt down from their horses and grabbed their little brother. Their horses spooked and tore off into the wilderness. Cindy tried desperately to kick and punch the mountain lion as it pinned her down. Frantically, she tried again and again to disarm the beast, but it slashed her over and over with its sharp claws. It bit her on her face and chest with its 2-inch-long canines. The attack was rapid and vicious. With the sound of their mother's desperate fight behind them, David and Melissa half dragged and half carried Stephen back down the track. He was bleeding profusely. His scalp was torn and his face bloodied. He was screaming and crying in agony as they hurriedly made their way over the rough and unforgiving terrain. Without looking back, the trio eventually made it back to the car over 1.5 miles away. The sound of their mother's cries had died down as they neared the car park. 11-year-old Melissa stayed with Stephen by the car while 13-year-old David ran to a nearby campsite. He screamed for help, and one of the campers, Jim Mannion, came running. He and David leapt into his pickup truck and sped up the track. It had been an hour since the attack, and David didn't know what he would find. It was an agonizing wait as the truck bumped and crashed its way towards Cindy. They made it to the spot, and Jim screeched to a halt. Jumping out of the vehicle, they looked around. Then they heard it, muffled groans and cries. In the bushes, only feet from the attack site, Cindy was still putting up a fight. The 60-pound mountain lion had tried to drag her away. It was still on top of her, unable to subdue the determined mother. Jim raised his gun, but with all the commotion, he was afraid of hitting Cindy. He fired a shot into the ground, and then he threw stones and rocks at the animal until it turned its attention to him. Its muzzle red and wet, its jaws open, the mountain lion locked its eyes on Jim. Slowly, it edged closer. David took a step backwards. Then as the mountain lion sprang forwards, Jim fired his gun, and the mountain lion yelped and fled into the undergrowth. Jim and David rushed over to Cindy. Miraculously, she was still alive, but she knew her time was up. After an incredible fight for over an hour, she had only one question, and that was whether her children were safe. Upon hearing that they were fine and recovering, she sighed in relief and closed her eyes. Jim picked her up and rushed her to the hospital, but she was pronounced dead on arrival. Stephen was taken to the same hospital. He had suffered significant tears to his scalp and required 70 stitches, but thanks to the heroic actions of his mom, he went on to make a full recovery. Conservation officers searched the attack site. They found the mountain lion lying dead in the undergrowth, 150 yards from where it had attacked Cindy. It had died from Jim's gunshot wound. The officers claimed that the mountain lion was a youngster that had probably recently been left by its mother. Hungry and being forced to fend for itself, it attacked opportunistically when it saw the family on horseback. The Governor General of Canada posthumously awarded Cindy the Star of Courage for her incredible bravery. Her loss was felt far and wide. Over 600 mourners attended her funeral, including Jim Manion. She was a popular member of the community, and her courage was honored by so many for doing what every good mother would do: risk her life to save her children from meeting their final affliction. In Orange County, California, mountain lions prowl from the Santa Ana mountain range's foothills and canyons up to the summits. These enormous and agile beasts are a keystone species here as they help regulate the deer populations, keeping the ecosystem balanced for all its inhabitants. Unfortunately, even though mountain lions give birth to several kittens each spring, their population isn't increasing. This is due to vehicle collisions, rodenticides, and habitat loss in the area. Additionally, the ones in the Santa Ana Mountains cannot procreate with other mountain lions in other areas because they are landlocked. As terrifying as they are, mountain lions are actually highly reclusive. They would never go out of their way to make contact with humans, as they are generally afraid of us. Moreover, there are no documented cases of mountain lions deliberately hunting or stalking humans. So then, how do we explain the attacks? Some experts believe mountain lions attack because people unwittingly provoke them. Those who accidentally get too close to the creature's kittens initiate a defensive response from the lion. They also react similarly if people get too close to their recent kill. After all, these creatures eat few and far between, so a recent kill might be its first meal in a long time. Nevertheless, unusual cases do happen, as is the case of Mark Reynolds and Ann Yella. January 8, 2004 was a day like any other. The desert hills of Whiting Wilderness Park had always been inviting, and Mark Reynolds was enticed as ever. Mark was a 35-year-old competitive cyclist working for a sports marketing company. He was a dedicated athlete who loved the outdoors and raced bicycles and motocross through rough terrain. Most of the time, Mark would cycle through the trails of Whiting Wilderness Park with his friends. However, today was different. He decided to go into the unpredictable desert hills alone, without a gun or pepper spray. He was experienced after all. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a grave mistake. The trail system is full of twists and turns that stretch for miles. Consequently, people who get lost here may not be found for a long time, not to mention the dangers of lurking predators in the area. As Mark rode his bike through the trail, a sinister force was brewing. Around half an hour into his ride, Mark approached a small climb and pedaled hard to reach the top. Suddenly, the chain broke and hung from the front sprocket. Looking down, he pulled at the two ends of the chain, snapping it in half. The chain had succumbed to the stress of the ride. Mark quickly parked his bike beside a bush and crouched over the broken chain, trying to devise a solution. Out of nowhere, a mountain lion appeared and tackled Mark, knocking him to the ground. Mark tried to fight against it, but the millions of years of evolution taught the beast to go for prey's vital areas. The mountain lion dug its claws into Mark's shoulders and bit him in the neck and face, suffocating him and cutting off his blood supply. Although Mark screamed in pain, nobody could hear him, he was alone, and Mark didn't stand a chance. When he finally succumbed to the injuries, the big cat dragged Mark's lifeless body into the nearby bush where it would begin to consume him. Ann Yella was heading out with her friend Debbie Nichols for a day of cycling in the desert hills of Whiting Wilderness Park. It was a typical day for the two women. At 19, Ann enlisted in the Marine Corps and was stationed in California. This was the ideal life for her since she had long been passionate about the outdoors. Ann was a hardy woman working as a hydraulics mechanic for helicopters, so it was not unusual that her favorite sport was mountain biking, a sport that required a lot of endurance and toughness. Ann and Debbie loved to ride in the park's desert trails. Their favorite spot was a narrow stretch filled with twists and turns called Cactus Hill. On January 8th, Ann and Debbie arrived at the park after work. They were supposed to do a quick 45-minute ride. However, what was supposed to be another uneventful day for them turned into a frightening encounter. Dropping into Cactus Hill, the two women rode down the trail fast, unaware of the ominous danger ahead. A few minutes into the ride, Anne, who was in the lead, came upon another rider parked along the narrow trail. She stopped and asked him if he needed any help. The man pointed to a parked bike, seemingly abandoned for a few hours. He told Anne the owner wasn't there. It was Mark's bike. Thinking nothing of it, Anne pressed on. She continued down the trail, not knowing the seemingly abandoned bike she saw was a sign of something terrible. Shortly after, Anne came upon a little rise and prepped for the trail's final descent. Suddenly, Anne saw a flash of movement in the corner of her eye. Initially, Anne thought she had startled a deer. However, her suspicions were soon dispelled when she felt the ferocious impact of 110 pounds of pure feline muscle moving at 35 miles per hour. She couldn't even finish her thought when she felt the teeth and claws grab hold of her. Anne was knocked to the ground and in the death grip of a mountain lion. She let out a blood-curdling scream as the lion's razor-sharp claws ripped into her shoulders. The animal was so strong, all Anne could do was cry out, "Jesus, help me." The mountain lion grabbed Anne by the back of the neck and tried to move around towards her throat. It dragged her 2 or 3 feet and then readjusted its grip, clamping down on the side of her face. The creature separated Anne's ear from her skull. It kept pulling and readjusting, eventually biting Anne's nose and breaking it. Like a hot knife through butter, Anne's cheek peeled away at the unimaginable strength of the lion's bite. Anne punched the lion's face over her shoulder, but it had no effect whatsoever. Eventually, Anne's screams echoed through the trail, and Debbie, who had just arrived around the corner, heard her friend's cry for help. Not knowing what awaited her, Debbie braved the startling situation and ran towards Anne. She was met with a gruesome scene. Debbie saw her friend on the ground painted in blood, and although she was filled with disturbing terror, she was equally enraged at the beast's violent attempt to take her friend's life. Debbie grabbed hold of her only weapon, her bike, and threw it with immense ferocity at the animal. Unfortunately, it had no effect on the frenzied beast. Realizing the animal was pulling Anne down into a ravine, Debbie reacted quickly and ran to her friend. She pulled Anne's leg to try and prevent her from experiencing a ghastly demise. It became a one-sided tug of war. "I'm not letting go, I'm not letting go," Debbie yelled as she pulled with all her might, digging her heels into the ground. Eventually, the mountain lion reached Anne's neck and clamped down on her throat. Knowing she was basically dying, Anne looked at her friend as if to say goodbye and blacked out, and it would have been the end of her. Fortunately, other mountain bikers appeared and saw the brutal struggle. They pelted the mountain lion with stones, hitting it in the back of the neck. It worked, and the mountain lion loosened its grip on Anne and took off into the wilderness. Anne became conscious afterward, and the first thing she saw was Debbie desperately trying to call her attention. Anne was shocked that she was still alive. However, breathing was near impossible as she choked on her own blood. The riders and Debbie carried Anne closer to the trail. Anne felt the weight of her mangled cheek hanging from her face. Within 19 minutes, paramedics arrived and placed Anne on a stretcher. She was airlifted to the hospital where she had to undergo emergency surgery. The doctors reattached the nerves and reconstructed her face. Miraculously, Anne survived the harrowing ordeal. The doctors realized if the mountain lion had bitten Anne a few centimeters off, it would have ruptured her carotid artery. "It's a good thing you were there," Anne said as Debbie entered the room in the hospital. After just 8 days, Anne was discharged and went on to live a normal life with her family. Although the slight disfiguration of her face from the attack took a toll on her psychological state, Anne was able to get by thanks to her family and friends' support. "I don't see scars, I didn't see injuries, all I see is my beautiful wife," said Anne's husband. Anne was fortunate there were people around her at the time of the attack. However, Mark wasn't so lucky. When the helicopter airlifted Anne, they noticed a body on the ground. It was Mark. The unfortunate incident prompted the California Department of Fish and Game to hunt for the rogue mountain lion. After exterminating the creature, authorities performed a necropsy on the animal. They extracted tissues of the lungs, skin, and liver from Mark's body. However, the question remains, why did the mountain lion attack? In Mark's case, it was probably because he was crouching as he fixed his bike. While mountain lions generally stay away from humans, they are more likely to attack small prey. To the creature, a crouching person and a small, vulnerable animal may be indistinguishable. Afterwards, the mountain lion took Mark into a different area and partially hid his body for later consumption. When Anne was riding down Cactus Hill, she unknowingly got close to Mark's corpse, prompting the beast to attack in her defense. Soon, Anne became friends with Mark's family and had been active in the Mark J. Reynolds Memorial Fund, a charity that provides bicycles to underprivileged children. Since the attack, Anne has undergone 6 more reconstructive surgeries, allowing her to return to her normal life as a trainer. Meanwhile, Mark's family sued Orange County for the incident. However, they dropped it after hearing about numerous protests from cyclists claiming they knew about the risks of entering mountain lion territory. Although they tend to be reclusive and actively avoid humans, mountain lions are still dangerous creatures. We should enter their territory with the utmost respect, doing everything in our power to take the necessary precautions. Failing to do so might just amount to your unfortunate final affliction.